of interested. I grew up as with Islam being, I was brought up in a Muslim family, which I later sort of rejected through my teenage years, and then going back to Pakistan to do a residency, I kind of found something. One of the things that stood out with me from having sort of the Islamic faith through childhood was that music was kind of frowned upon. Music was something that wasn't really to be engaged with, because it led to infidelity. So that was, it wasn't the only reason, but that was one of the reasons. It was one of the things that kind of led me to reject sort of religious faith altogether. So this trip in Pakistan, I kind of discovered lots of sort of. I was fascinated by how music was sort of embedded in society and culture, just through everyday praxis, everyday things that happen, and just normal everyday engagement with music. But particularly in the Islamic faith, with the call to prayer or how the Quran was recited. So those, so that sort of led to this huge sort of this contradiction within the faith as to why, so I was kind of confused as to why this was happening. There are sort of certain regimes in the Islamic faith, such as like Sufism, which use music to sort of get closer to God, but most regimes are sort of against music. So this is kind of a second and third work that came out of a whole body of work sort of dealing with this subject in quite an abstract way at first, but this is quite explicit. I was actually invited by Celine to make a work for the Islam, a video work. So this was the video that's being shown here was made for that. And as it was being shown in Istanbul, I thought this was a kind of a nice opportunity to kind of talk about this subject again. So this film is kind of a transcription of the Islamic call to prayer. So this guy who's doing his actions is basically doing the movement of the call to prayer. However, the words have been removed and motifs from the cello have replaced the words. And then here's Cat Stevens on a monitor, kind of is playing a small loop. It's kind of a loop of him performing in the 70s, I think it was. And Cat Stevens famously gave up his career in music when he converted to Islam and changed his name to Yusuf Islam. And so he had the same kind of dilemma about music and his faith. So I thought it was kind of a nice reference to incorporate Cat Stevens into the piece. So the piece forms this kind of musical composition with Cat Stevens playing a riff on the guitar and then the cellist, and the whole thing becomes kind of a musical composition. So later on, this piece was shown in Dublin for an exhibition that was called Anthomosa, which is the name of a Greek island, it's a mythological island in Greece, of Greek mythology, and it's said to have been where the sirens had lived. So the sirens, so I got interested in this idea of the calling and music as a means for attracting, and sound seems to do that. If you, especially in exhibitions, if you go into an exhibition space and you hear a sound, you've got this kind of draw to that sound source. In the same way as the azan is calling, a call to prayer. And the sirens was an interesting point to me because they were also calling these sailors, this kind of romantic, sort of beautiful sound, but it was to their demise. So So I kind of related this to religion in the way that religion is also this kind of, it's about death in a way, it's about the fear of death and the inevitability of death. And so the call to the prayer is also has this relationship to death, which is sort of an analogy for what the sirens were doing in the mythologies. So there was another piece called Birds of Prayer, which is a much larger piece which isn't included in this show, which was a portrait of two sirens. And this smaller piece is called SOS, and it's also kind of this. It's a musical accompaniment to the whole installation, and it's kind of a slow-paced siren in a way. So the three pieces together form this kind of really long, say 10-minute audio composition, which kind of unfolded and changed as it kind of went along. So I often use sort of household equipment and furniture and electronics and appliances to sort of generate sounds that are bringing something old and new together, like an energy-saving light bulb, which is relatively new in relation to a transistor radio, discovering that it causes an interference, and that interference is obviously a sound. So I use these sounds to kind of, I create these sounds by doing simple things like this, and then layer them and kind of add structure to create pieces of music. So in this version of the installation, it's the composition on there, which is generally created with the same means, apart from obviously the cello and the guitar, and this is a kind of accompaniment in the same key to form the piece.
It's interesting when you first heard that was a musical accompaniment, so now you're interested in this sort of music slipped up into sound or senses. When does that kind of change take place?
Yeah.
Something that's really interesting.
Sure. I think in this instance it's interesting that the sound for this is off right now, because at the moment, you hear this kind of buzzing noise, and that's all it sounds like. It sounds like kind of a weird buzz, and I don't think right now you would necessarily sort of call it music. It'd be like a noise or a sound, so you kind of perceive it in that way. But once this is on, the audio for this is on, I think it kind of you have this perceptual shift.
It does have that low frequency cello sound.
Yeah, it does, yeah.
So is that is being created live as the light passes over the what is it?
It's just a radio, transistor radio. Yeah, so I'm interested in this kind of perceptual shift that takes place, and I kind of rationalise it in the difference between hearing and listening. So you might be hearing a noise or a sound, but you don't really register it. But once you start listening to it, that's kind of a sort of perceptual difference, and then things can start happening. So you can start perceiving a certain noise or a certain sound as a musical element. And I guess I'm interested in those kind of shifts. It's the same. For me, it's the same sort of shift that occurs when you see a photorealistic painting. So you might be looking at this image, and you might assume it's a photograph, but when you get closer and you see the brush strokes, that your perception sort of shifts from seeing to looking almost. So you've got, so you see from seeing a photograph or an image to seeing, to looking at the painting, looking at the brush strokes. So it's those really tiny moments that I'm kind of trying to focus in on as a way to kind of, as a sort of exploration, I guess.
Okay, so I work a lot with sound. Most of my work is actually based on. I'm kind of focused on the city and stories of cities, rumours, people who live there, but also the processes of expansion and change that happen in cities. And I kind of document that and work with that in sound and drawings and different things. And often that comes out as, it might come out as a CD, or it might come out as a sound walk, like an audio guide for a city or something like that. But this piece is completely different. So I thought I'd just say that first. But this is a very documentary piece, and it's very nice actually that it's kind of opposite the film by Luke Fowler about Cornelius Cardew, because it's very, very related in theme. It's also about a period in the 60s when composers and artists, I suppose, working with sound, but composers working with experimental music were really interested in how to compose freedom in music. It was a politically driven kind of quest to which Cornelius Cardew was very involved in. If you want to open a composition out of just, instead of just writing notes, you want to have more room for people to have more input, or maybe people who can't read music, or people who are not musicians to join in. How do you compose that in a composition? There was a lot of reaction against the kind of traditions of the orchestra, which was considered to be elitist, and people started working a lot with theatre and improvisation and things like that, as well as the kind of things that were happening in music. So the expansion of, say, the use of electronics, which was introducing electronic sound or recorded sound, actual sound from which you wouldn't normally consider as being music, suddenly taking place in a musical composition. So it was a very kind of interesting time, and a lot of people were working with this. This piece, the main part of it, which you hear through loudspeakers, was recorded at a concert in 1969 at the Holland Festival in Amsterdam in the Concertgebouw, which is a huge kind of, it's kind of like the Albert Hall, if you like, of Amsterdam. It doesn't really look like it, but it has that sort of same kind of function. And it was a piece by Karl-Heinz Stockhausen called Stimmung, which means tuning, but it also means mood, or it's tuning in all sorts of different ways. Like the English word tuning also means lots of different things. So there was this piece, this recording was made, and what happened was that somebody let me hear this recording once, because it had never been broadcast. It was made by the NOS, sort of the BBC of Holland, if you like. And so it was a concert recording, but after about 10 minutes or something, you start to hear the audience joining in. It's a very, very quiet piece for four, I think, singers. And it's very meditative, it's very long, it's very quiet, although it's amplified. So it's a very delicate piece, and the singers actually, it's not really improvised, but the singers kind of communicate with each other by they can choose different parts, and it's quite a complex piece. Even though when you listen to it, it sometimes just sounds like people messing about. I mean, if you look at the score, you think, oh, it's actually quite complicated. So people start joining in, and then people start clapping or laughing and talking, and then the concert stops. Stockhausen comes on stage and stops the concert. And they try again, and they start again, they start all over again. And they ask people who don't want to listen to please leave. And then they start it again, and the same thing happens. It's impossible, the concert gets stopped. But then it turns into a discussion, first in the hall. You just hear all these people shouting, swearing at each other. People are incredibly violent to each other, actually, verbally. Then people start to come onto the stage and actually get a microphone and start to speak through the microphone, and it actually turns into a discussion about music and participation and democracy, and the fact that some of the audience felt they should be able to join in. They actually criticised Stockhausen for not including the audience in the score, which is a kind of strange thing to say after the fact. And what's actually very historically interesting is that a lot of the people who are talking, I mean, it's in Dutch, but it's translated, so you can see kind of subtitles on the monitor. The people aren't identified, but they're actually quite famous composers, a lot of the people talking, or writers. And 2 days later, in the same festival, these people who were, you might know a few of the names, Louis Andriessen is maybe the most famous in England, Peter Scott, Michel Mengelberg, were working together with Harry Mullish and Hugo Claus, who were writers. They were making an opera which was about Che Guevara. And this was happening 2 days later, and these are the people actually you hear quite often interrupting and discussing. But I think it's just an experience you have to. I'll explain a bit in the piece. There's actually, you hear the sound. I've made an edit of the piece, and you hear the audience interruptions in the discussion. You hear that through loudspeakers. But on the floor of cushions, it's kind of a set out a little bit like the stage was. So where the singers were actually sitting cross-legged on cushions in a circle with headphones on. So it's almost like you kind of take, if you choose to sit on the cushions and listen, you're kind of taking the place of the performers in a way. But I kind of did that because I'm interested in what you do now as an audience. Like, because you have a choice either to listen to you can listen to the audience, or you can listen to the discussion, or you can listen to the music. So actually what you hear on the headphones is another recording made later of the piece that the audience should have heard that they never heard. So it's a sort of recombination of the two things.
It's really interesting that in this piece the participation is kind of forced upon the composer and the composition, which contrasts quite nicely with the Fowler piece where the composer, Cornelius Cardew, is trying to, with the scratch orchestra where everybody plays their own, makes sounds in their own way and kind of just comes together simultaneously with these different sounds. It's trying to almost enforce participation and everybody to do kind of individual sounds and actions. And what comes through quite strongly in this film, which is quite a long first 45 minutes, is the idea that people are actually really desperate for direction and wanting direction to actually to form that community. Whereas actually what he's trying to do is to form this ad hoc communities actually forces kind of wedges between people, and it's really quite sort of just sounds quite destructive in that way. So it's really interesting that the dynamics of that impulse to participation, I suppose, in the community.
Yeah, it starts off as kind of this activism, there's a means to an end to it, but then it turns into, and it's really evident in this film, where it just turns into complete chaos in that way. But then there's the ones that embrace the chaos, and it's kind of, the dynamics are really quite interesting. And
at some point in this piece, you hear the sound technicians talking to each other, and one of them says, This is what is this? This is live theatre. Yeah, it's live theatre. That's what it is. And also you hear that the sound technicians are having an awful lot of trouble keeping up, because there's obviously, if you're recording a concert with microphones all over the place, but people are shouting and they don't know where they are, so you hear sometimes people are really loud or really quiet.
It's quite prescient to actually continue the recording, because you imagine if it was the BBC, they would kind of cut.
Yeah. Well, actually, now you can actually listen to. It's still not the full, because the tape I had was from the archive of the radio, and it had edited it at some point. So it was obviously a copy which had been edited. So I never heard the original. And even so, it was already like 70 minutes long, and it was a whole reel of reel to. And you can actually find the original recording now on the internet, but still there are cuts. I think there are two different. It's funny because there are different versions, and it's hard to know whether they're actually different mixes or recorded by different people. They sound slightly different, even though exactly the same things.
It's interesting that at that moment in time, it was such an issue about this active participation that I think perhaps we don't have a sense of that anymore. There would be no sense that you would go to a concert now and there would be this sense that might happen.
No. I mean,
you said you found that different between you moved to the Netherlands from England as well. The nature of the audience.
At that time, when I moved from Sheffield to, this was at the end of the 80s, and I was used to audiences being rowdy, throwing things sometimes. And then in Holland, I was surprised how kind of polite they were, but they were just like, oh, that's very interesting.
Well, one thing here is, this It's Amsterdam, it's not Paris.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, as if Amsterdam is the centre, which is strange because in Paris had just had like 1968, the students on the streets, and in fact Amsterdam had that kind of it was a different kind of revolution, if you like, that happened in Amsterdam. It happened earlier with Pro-Rose. I think it was 2 years earlier, so they'd already kind of gone through this thing. They felt it was kind of normal that they should just be able to do what they wanted. But I wonder how much actually this was maybe. It's quite possible that it was a bit of a setup against Stockhausen, because I mean there's always this rivalry in Holland against the Germans. I mean, okay, you get this. If you look at the newspapers here, it's kind of the same thing. Okay? But in Holland, it's kind of even more ingrained somehow. And Stockhausen being known as a kind of quite a dictatorial figure, and you had to do the music in this way, and otherwise you couldn't do it. I think
one of the chapters of this film is Stockhausen serves imperialism.
Yes, yeah.
So that was an essay written by Connor's Cardio against Stockhausen, who had been his tutor or mentor.
Yeah, because Cardew worked with Stockhausen.